Hi, I'm Tom and I'm a tenants advocate at the Inner Sydney Tenants Advice and Advocacy Service, part of the Redfern Legal Centre. When we're talking about appeals in social housing, we're talking about an application to Housing New South Wales or to a community housing provider to reconsider a decision they've made in relation to a tenant. You might also hear it called an internal appeal or an internal review of a decision. Common examples of decisions that can be appealed are a decision that a housing applicant is not eligible to be housed in social housing, a decision about the rent subsidy that a tenant is entitled to, or a decision to issue a strike notice against a tenant. Not all decisions can be appealed. If a social housing provider has made a decision against a tenant, the first step will be to look at the appeals policy of that provider. It should be available on their website and it might be called an appeals and complaints policy. If the provider hasn't got a copy of the policy on their website, you should call them and ask for a copy. A provider's appeal policy should talk about what decisions can be appealed, where to send an appeal, how a provider handles and responds to an appeal, and the time limit for putting in an appeal. It's important to pay particular attention to the time limits, as these can sometimes be very strict and different time limits can attach to different decisions. Keep in mind though that some social housing providers will consider an appeal even if it's made beyond the time limit. Appeals don't have to be overly complicated or legalistic. Generally speaking, a good appeal should show that a provider's decision didn't comply with its policy, or there are circumstances that mean that the provider should apply its policy with more flexibility in this particular case. It's a good idea to include some background about the tenant's circumstances and any relevant documents in an appeal. If a decision isn't changed on appeal, there is usually at least one more level of appeal. An appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee will usually be the final level of appeal. The Housing Appeals Committee is an independent body that hears appeals from some decisions made by social housing providers. An appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee can only be made after all the provider's internal appeal avenues have been exhausted. After hearing an appeal, the Housing Appeals Committee will make a recommendation to the social housing provider about whether or not they should change the original decision. Recommendations from the Housing Appeals Committee are just that, recommendations. They're not binding on the social housing provider. Providers will, however, usually follow the recommendation of the Housing Appeals Committee. I'll emphasise two things about appeals in social housing. First, if a tenant's rent subsidy is cancelled following an allegation that the tenant has failed to properly disclose their income to a housing provider, it's important to get advice from a tenant's advocate or from a legal service. And it's important to do this before submitting an appeal or responding to the allegation at all. Tenants in these cases are at risk of incriminating themselves. Second, if the Housing Appeals Committee has made a recommendation and a social housing provider hasn't followed the recommendation, get in touch with a tenant's advocate. We're interested to hear about these cases.